Welcome to Fos, where we are inviting each person to find hope, beauty, and purpose in the story of Jesus. If you don't recognize me, I'm Glenn, and I'll be joined today by Carl as we get to discuss the disruptive potential of invitation. Because invitation opens us up to hospitality to where we get to sit across the table from each other. And as John Caputo tells us, hospitality cuts deeply into the fabric of the biblical name of God, where the invisible face of God is inscribed on the face of the stranger, as if God were looking for shelter. Well beyond its stature as a particular virtue, hospitality is a figure of the event. If you can see what is coming, it is not an event. If you already know who is on the other side of the door, it is not hospitality, or only half. Now, I'm not calling for stupidity, but for a judgment and invitation that is willing to take a risk. So, an event, by definition, changes the expected ending. It brings something new to history's endless repetition. For hospitality to be an event, it must embody risk. It must keep the table and community open to changing from the presence of the unexpected guest, rather than conforming them to our comfort level. The story of Martha's hospitality, found in Luke 10, is set right after the righteous Samaritan. Martha honors the unexpected guest by setting the table and demonstrating hospitality. Her actions follow immediately after the Good Samaritan, who sees a stranger in need and neighbors him. That story of the Good Samaritan ends with a lawyer admitting tangible mercy overshadows proper piety and the rule of law. Jesus then says, "Go and do likewise." So now Martha's story begins as she goes and does likewise. Yet she is told one thing is needed. Mary has chosen the better part. You see, within this story, Martha goes out, invites Jesus in, sets the table, and says, Mary sits at the feet of Jesus. She comes in and says, Jesus, do you not care that I am left alone to do everything? And he said, you're distracted by so many things. One thing is needed, and Mary has chosen the better way. A straightforward reading causes us to turn Mary into a virtue and Martha into a vice. Mary is spiritual, Martha is material. Mary cares about Jesus, Martha cares about appearances. But without Martha, Jesus is never in the house for Mary to sit beside. Without Martha, the spiritual never becomes tangible. As Meister Eckhart has said, Martha understands that the name of God is the name of a deed, so she receives a double blessing. This leaves me wondering, what is the needed one thing? It can't be fealty, since she acknowledged Jesus as master or sovereign. It can't be mercy. She saw need and set a table. Maybe it's her presence. Martha is needed. Without her, the people wouldn't be cared for. However, she was distracted from the people rather than allowing service to create an attachment to them. Jesus previously praised a profane, compassionate response over proper piety, but the profane act of compassion needs to draw us towards others rather than creating boundaries between us. Just like Mary sitting at Jesus' feet only works if she remembers it's never just her and Jesus. It's about all around the table. Both are worthy of critique when Mary's best part takes her into spiritual isolation, or Martha's faithfulness becomes bitter service. Both paths of isolation or bitterness will draw us away from community. Yet both Mary and Martha are worth emulating when their virtues draw them towards Jesus and others. And because today we have no direct access to Jesus, today we can't say we're sitting at the table with Christ. It must now draw us towards Jesus in the other. So I ask, what is your one thing needed to allow you presence at the table?
I love the question that Glenn asks. What is the one thing needed? And you can't ask that question without tying it into the end of the story where Jesus tells Martha that Mary has chosen the good part. But the thing is that Jesus doesn't tell us what the one thing is. nor does Jesus tell us what the good part is. And so we're left as readers of this story to interpret, to guess, to begin to fill in the blanks. And I remember when in our devotional time, when Glenn was offering up a reflection on this passage, this part just stood out to me that when Jesus doesn't actually tell us what these things are, so the good part seems to be that Mary is settled in her choice. She is comfortable with her choice. She has chosen to be at the feet of Jesus, just like the other disciples have chosen to be at the feet of Jesus. She has chosen to be present as a host, as the one who sits with, not the one who serves. But that was her choice, and she's comfortable with it. But Martha has also made a choice. Martha chose to invite Jesus into the house. She chose to offer hospitality. She chose to serve, but she's not comfortable with her choice. She's not settled with her choice. In fact, her choice is causing her to feel anxiety. Her choice is causing her to feel isolation. And I think that's the difference. That's the one thing that Jesus is talking about. The one thing that is needed is to be comfortable with the decision, to be comfortable with the way that you choose to show up, to be comfortable with the way that you are present. And when at the end of the story where Jesus says, I'm not going to take the good part away from Mary, I think for me at least, again, coming off of Glenn's reflection, it really sat with me that that good part that he doesn't want to take, he's not going to bring anxiety to Mary because of what she chose. He's not going to unsettle her decision because Martha was feeling unsettled in her decision. And it's for me, it's just a really interesting thing as well, is that, and this came from my own reflection as well on this passage, was that in Mary's choice of beginning to feel anxious, we read the story as chastisement from Jesus, as this big public thing where Jesus is chastising, condemning her in front of everybody else. But there's a little part of the story where it says Mary went to Jesus. And I began to imagine this conversation playing out as a private, personal conversation where Jesus is offering her liberation. He's offering her exhortation. He's offering her encouragement, actually, to be like, hey, it's okay. You can change your perspective. It's okay. You can be okay with your decision. You have chosen, Mary has chosen, and that's great. Allow her to be in her choice. And I want you to be comfortable and to give yourself permission to be in your choice. And so I think this notion of invitation does play out to this idea of choice, because Mary chose to show up in a particular way and Martha chose to show up in a particular way, but both accept Jesus's invitation to be present. Okay. So I want to return to the question that Glenn asked. What is the one thing that is needed? And although that question, I think, is open for interpretation, and we can talk about it in all sorts of different ways, the way that I've interpreted the story, the way that I see this story beginning to play out now, is that the one thing that is needed is a change of perspective. We need to learn how to be settled in our presence. We need to learn how to be settled in the way that we show up, because let's be honest, a lot of us have social anxiety in the way that we show up. We feel uncomfortable in the ways that we show up. I know I feel uncomfortable a lot of times in the ways that I show up. And if we can learn to be settled in the presence of Jesus, if we can learn to be settled in the presence of others, it's not even a changing of position or changing of what we're doing or changing of how we show up. It's a changing of perspective that says the way we show up is enough. The way that we show up matters. The way that we show up, it's all good.
It just took my mind to a place of thinking about, is the one thing needed comfort in how I show up, or comfort with how others show? Because her angst came as the projection onto Mary not showing up as she wants to show up.
Mhm.
Martha's angst isn't about Martha. Martha's angst is about Mary sitting at the feet and not showing up in her way.
See, I would agree with you, but I would also add that it's actually about her own thing, because Martha, her perspective is that hospitality is the thing that matters here. So her anxiety is that Mary is also not offering hospitality in the way that Martha thinks hospitality is needed. So her
Mhm.
anxiety is connected to Martha, but it's also connected to herself. So I would agree 100% with you on that. I would just kind of add that little bit of a caveat that often the things that we project to others are really about the way that we feel insecure about the way that we are showing up. But what changes when we create space for ourselves and others to show up with an unanxious presence?
Cool. One of the biggest things that changes to me when we let go of some of the expectations and the projection of our anxieties onto others is it creates multiple avenues to be present. And as we even saw in the story, like Martha, the host, the one who had some anxious drive, she invited in, she was hospitable while still letting go of control over the table. She came up to Jesus and said, "Do you not care that Mary isn't showing up the way I show up?" And his response wasn't to make Martha into Mary or to make Mary into Martha. His response was that there's one thing needed, which, as Carl pointed out, seems to be the acceptance of multiple avenues at the table, multiple ways to be present. So when we let go of a one way, you have to serve in this fashion, or you have to be this kind of student. If we let go of that aspect, then we can have a more robust conversation around the table because we don't have to be adherent to creeds, to orthodoxies. We don't have to say because it's always been done this way, therefore it must always be done this way. We can allow space for the new, the novel, and the disruptive to be fully present, fully belong, and then even change the way that we can enter into space because we accept not only our own presence, but the presence of the other.
Mhm. No, it's really good. Just your response before I kind of go into my own thoughts that I had on that question. And it reminded me of this video that I saw from Richard Rohr, where he talks about the different confessional creeds that are part of Christianity. So the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Westminster Confession, things like that. That all of these creeds and confessions have all these different orthodoxy and doctrine and dogma as part of them, but not a single one of them mentions love. And then I would venture to say that on top of that, none of them mention hospitality. And the one thing that Jesus says is that people will know you're my disciples by your love for one another. And then we talk about the great commandment and things like that, where Jesus tells people it's like love others and love your neighbor and love God, basically, right? And to me, I would say that that moves into the notion of presence, and that moves into the notion of hospitality, and so like our faith probably should be built around this idea of love and acceptance and love and hospitality. So, circling back to the question for me, what changes when we create space for ourselves and others to show up with an unanxious presence? Is I think the table begins to naturally expand. It naturally begins to extend itself because I'm not looking for people to show up the way that I show up in order for me to feel comfortable. Because again, it's not just about creating space for others to show up with with an unanxious presence. It's also creating space for myself to show up with an unanxious presence. Meaning that there's a perspective shift that needs to happen within myself that says others are okay to show up the way they show up. I don't need to be looking at Mary and saying she's not showing up the way that I'm showing up. And just as Mary wasn't looking at Martha, Mary wasn't even concerned with Martha in the sense of Martha's not doing what I'm doing. Martha, like, what are you doing? Get at the feet of Jesus. None of that kind of stuff. And I feel like that's the beauty of community is that when we actually create space for everyone to show up the way that they're going to show up, including ourselves, and we allow that to happen in an unanxious way, we get to see the beauty of the table. We get to see the gift of the table because Glenn shows up differently than I show up. And I'm going to show up differently than Megan shows up. And Megan's going to show up differently than Marissa shows up, and so on and so on and so on. And that's a beautiful thing. Like we got to see that last week in the message where Megan had a certain way that she presented, and then Marissa had another way that she presented. And when you saw those things come together, to me, it just created this wonderful dynamism, that like dynamic kind of duo type thing. But I think it was just wonderful the way that they were able to show up, and I think that's just a great example of for our community and for even like just this whole story how it plays out.
And I think you're alluding to something that's very impactful, kind of pulling from the John Caputo quote, that hospitality enables us to witness the face of God inscribed on the stranger. What really changes in this when we let go of some of the anxious expectations that say we have to show up like each other is the face of God changes. Like the literal notion of the incarnate face of God changes. Because, yes, for the first century, for Luke, for the people at that table, Jesus was a singular entity focused in one point. But now, as a continued body of believers and the faithful, we understand that Jesus is the full body of the church, the full body of Christ. So it's multifaceted. So once we let go of trying to return Jesus back to the singularity, return us back to an ancient Near Eastern table with one person as the head, we get to accept the God within each person showing up. And so the very face of God changes. And the more we get to see and expand on that, the more we let go of the expectations and anxiety of that, the more we'll be able to witness the beauty in a God in each of one of us and the face of God changing in the experience, the wisdom of the beauty of each person.
I want to kind of ask a follow-up question in light of what you're saying. But what if the way that someone shows up is harmful to others? What do we do?
That's a great question. Because often where we can get concerned is when we say that we can't have an anxious control over, we then just swing the pendulum all the way to the other side and say, okay, chaotic hedonism and libertarian ideals, everyone do whatever you want. We don't see that in the stories. If the invitation is into hospitality and the hospitality demands of us to show up authentically in the ways that we show up to allow ourselves to be present, then where we speak against, where we stand together is when somebody's way of showing up does a tangible harm to others. Now, tangible can make it a bit difficult to name at times because you're like, oh, is this tangible because they didn't take food from me or they didn't steal out of my wallet? But if we're perpetuating the stories of women staying in their lane, we're doing tangible harm to women in presence. If we, as you see a rise in some of the conversations of white nationalism, hold on to this story of a white nationalist Jesus, we're doing harm to people. We're perpetuating cycles of abuse, distrust, and violence. Those things we actually speak against. We say, no, that is not an authentic way to show up, not because you don't think it or you don't believe it, but because what you're doing strips the divine of somebody else.
Mhm.
And those moments of harm, of violence, of coercion, we will say, yeah, that's the spot that we're actually serious about.
Yeah. And I think like the answer is also embedded in the first question of what changes when we create space for ourselves and others to show up with an unanxious presence. Because the moment I show up in ways that are creating tangible harm for somebody else, I'm creating an anxious presence for that person. And like to my some of my biggest regrets in leading communities is that I didn't actually, because I was trying to allow people to show up in their authentic self ways and all that kind of stuff, I didn't notice when there was actual tangible harm happening that was creating anxiety for somebody else because I was trying to allow someone else to show up without anxiety, right? And we have to be able to look and see that, especially if we have the responsibility of helping to like host the table. All of us do, right? We need to be on the lookout to say, okay, like, not that we're looking at like like oh, we're looking out for that person that's doing something bad, but just like, is there someone who like, hey, it looks like so and so is having a hard time being present. What's going on? Let's ask that question together as a community. And is it something that I'm doing? Is it something that someone else is doing that's having making it hard for them to be here? And if it is, like part of what changes when we create space for ourselves and others to show up is that we have to make adjustments. We have to be self-limiting sometimes so that others can be present. And that's a good thing. That's a beautiful thing.
So as we went through Luke 10 today, we discovered that the invitation of hospitality is a disruptive one that causes us to name our own anxieties so that we can create space for all people to enter. We will correct, we will delimit to the point that the way we enter causes somebody else to have to stay in a consistent state of anxiety. Because our purpose is to be able to expand our vision of God so that we can truly embrace the idea found throughout Scripture that the only way to witness Jesus is by us seeing the Jesus in you, by us experiencing the divine in you. And in that, we accept the invitation to the table